I was 300 feet down, suspended in the crushing blackness of the North Sea. My job as a deep sea welder was simple: fix the cracks in the oil rig's massive legs before the ocean tore it apart. The only light came from my helmet lamps, cutting a cone through the murky water. I was focused on my weld, the bright arc sizzling and popping, when I felt it. The water temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second, penetrating my suit. A pressure change, subtle but distinct, like something massive moving just past my peripheral vision, pushed against me. I turned my head, expecting a shark or maybe a curious seal. It wasn't. At the edge of the light, a pale, humanoid shape hung suspended in the water. It was too big to be a man, and it didn't have tanks. It just floated there, staring at me with eyes that glowed a faint, bioluminescent blue. I froze, my heart hammering against the inside of my ribcage like a trapped bird. My breath hitched in my throat, fogging my visor. It had fur, matted and slick against a powerful muscular frame that rippled with potential energy. It was impossible. Then, with a flick of powerful, webbed claws, it vanished back into the abyss with terrifying speed. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw. Something was alive down here, something that belonged in a nightmare, and it had just noticed me trespassing in its garden. The decompression chamber felt tighter than usual, the air heavy and stale. My heart hammered against my ribs. The image of those glowing blue eyes burned into my mind like a brand. When I finally stepped out onto the metal deck of the Vanguard, the air tasted metallic and cold. I went straight to the rig foreman, a gruff man named Briggs. He was reviewing drill logs, ignoring the sea spray hitting the windows. "There's something down there, boss," I said, my voice shaking slightly, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. A creature, big, man-sized, but not a man. It was watching me. It didn't look like a fish, Briggs. It looked like a wolf that learned to swim. Briggs laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the steel walls. "Nitrogen narcosis, Caleb," he said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, his eyes devoid of concern. "The deep plays tricks on you. The shadows get long down there. Go sleep it off." I tried to argue, to describe the matted fur and the intelligent gaze, but he just waved me away. No one believed me. To them, I was just another diver losing his nerve, cracking under the pressure. I went to my bunk, the rhythmic thrum of the drills below doing little to soothe my nerves. I knew what I saw wasn't a trick of the light. The ocean was hiding a secret, and I was the only one who knew it was watching us. By evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. The wind picked up, whistling through the metal grating of the rig's structure like a mournful flute playing a funeral dirge. A massive storm was rolling in from the north, a common occurrence here, but this one felt different. It felt angry, personal. The seagulls had vanished hours ago, fleeing inland. The waves below began to churn, crashing against the rig's legs with a violence that made the entire structure shudder and groan like a dying beast. I stood on the walkway, looking down at the frothing black water. The rig was a tiny island of light in a chaotic, hostile ocean. The earlier dismissal by Briggs gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just from the deep, but from the shadows of the rig itself. The storm was cutting us off. The satellite phone signal became spotty, voices turning into robotic gibberish, then died completely. We were isolated, 100 miles from shore, trapped on a metal beast in the middle of a raging ocean, with something impossibly old and hungry lurking just beneath the surface. The real fear wasn't the storm outside. It was the growing certainty that we weren't alone on the Vanguard. The darkness felt heavy, pressing in on all sides. The next morning, the storm was in full force. Rain lashed the decks horizontally, stinging any exposed skin like frozen needles.
I was assigned a routine check of the lower maintenance levels, just above the waterline. It was a miserable job, soaked in icy spray and deafened by the crashing waves that sprayed foam 30 feet into the air. As I walked along the slippery catwalk, something caught my eye on the rig's massive steel leg. It was a series of deep scratches, gouged right through the thick protective paint and deep into the metal itself. They were parallel, 4 grooves, spaced like giant claws. No equipment or debris could have made those marks. The steel was curled back like shaved butter. I ran a gloved hand over them. The metal edges were sharp and new, not rusted yet. A chill that had nothing to do with the icy spray ran down my spine. These marks weren't made by accident. They were carved with immense, deliberate force. I looked down at the churning water, my stomach twisting. The creature I saw deep down, it wasn't just staying in the abyss. It was coming up. It was testing the rig's defenses. The scratches were a message, a warning that the hunt had begun and we were the prey sitting in a metal cage. Lunch in the mess hall was tense. The storm outside was a constant roar shaking the coffee in our mugs, but inside, the silence was heavier. Briggs was pacing, looking anxious, checking his watch every 30 seconds. "Where's Evans?" he asked. Evans was Roughneck, a big guy who worked the drill floor. He was never late for meal. The man lived to eat. "I haven't seen him since shift change," someone muttered, staring into their soup. A knot formed in my stomach. I remembered the scratches on the leg. Briggs organized a search party. We split into pairs, checking every level of the rig. The rig was a maze of metal corridors, noisy machinery rooms, and shadowed catwalks. It was easy to get turned around, easy to hide, and terrifyingly easy to disappear. My partner was a young electrician named Ben. He was nervous, jumping at every clang of metal or hiss of steam. We searched the lower decks near where I found the scratches. The air here was damp and smelled of oil and brine. We found Evan's hard hat near a railing on the lowest level. It was dented, the strap broken violently. On the grating next to it was a single, large, wet footprint. It wasn't human. It looked like a massive bare foot with elongated toes and claw indentations. Ben shone his flashlight on the print, his hand shaking visibly, the beam dancing on the wet metal. "What is that, Caleb?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "It looks like a giant foot, but weird. Look at the heel. It's elongated." I knelt down, touching the slime left behind. The print was smeared, wet with seawater, leading towards the edge of the catwalk, right to the edge off into the churning ocean. "It's not human," I said, my voice flat. The realization hit us both with the force of a physical blow. Something had come up from the water, taken Evans, and gone back down. He hadn't fallen, he was taken. We weren't just dealing with a storm or a mechanical failure, we were being hunted. We rushed back to report to Briggs. He looked at the hard hat and listened to our description of the print, his face paling beneath his grease stains. He couldn't dismiss it as non-Trojan narcosis now. The evidence was right there. "Lock it down," he ordered, his voice tight with fear. "Nobody goes out on the deck alone. Everyone stays in pairs. We search everywhere inside." The rig, once our sanctuary from the ocean, had become a trap. The hunter was inside the cage with us. Fear spread through the crew like a virus. We were 18 men trapped on a metal island, cut off from the world. We gathered in the main rec room, the most secure area with heavy steel doors. Briggs cast out the few weapons we had, a couple of flare guns, some heavy wrenches, and fire axes. It wasn't much against a creature that could tear through steel, but the weight of the axe in my hand felt better than nothing. "We stayed together," Briggs said, trying to sound confident, but his voice cracked. "The storm will break soon. Help will come." But his eyes betrayed his fear. We all knew help was days away, even if the storm cleared. Outside, the wind howled, sounding more like a beast than weather, shaking the reinforced windows. Every creak of the rig, every slam of a wave made us jump. We took turns standing guard at the locked doors. I couldn't get the image of the glowing blue eyes out of my head. It had looked intelligent. It wasn't a mindless animal. It was planning, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The feeling of being watched was constant, a pressure on the back of my neck. We were under siege in the middle of the ocean. The psychological toll was mounting.
My shift for guard duty was the dead of night, though with the storm blocking the moon and stars, it was always dark. I was stationed with Ben near the generator room. The rhythmic thumping of the engines was hypnotic, vibrating through the floor, but my nerves were screaming. Every shadow looked like a monster. Ben was jittery, constantly checking his flashlight beam down the dark corridor. "Did you hear that?" he'd ask every few minutes, flinching at steam hissing from pipes. I tried to calm him down, but I was just as scared. Then I saw it. Through the reinforced glass portal of the door, a shadow moved across the catwalk outside. It was quick, fluid, and massive. It hunched low, moving on two legs but with a loping, animalistic grace that was deeply unsettling. I grabbed Ben's arm, pointing. He saw it too and let out a strangled gasp. The creature paused, its head turning toward the door. Two glowing blue orbs reflected the light from inside. It saw us. It knew where we were. It wasn't just patrolling, it was scouting our defenses. It was testing the locks with its eyes. The attack didn't come at the door we were guarding. It came from above. We heard a loud tearing sound, like metal being ripped apart, coming from the ventilation shaft in the ceiling of the corridor. Dust and bolts rained down. Before we could react, the heavy vent grate crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. A dark, wet shape dropped down into the hallway, landing with a heavy thud. It was bigger than I imagined, at least 7 feet tall. His fur was matted and black, slick with seawater. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in hands with razor-sharp claws. Its face was a nightmare, a wolf-like muzzle with elongated teeth, but with those same glowing, intelligent blue eyes. The smell hit us instantly, rotting kelp and wet musk. It let out a roar that wasn't a howl, but a guttural, vibrating sound that shook my very bones. Ben screamed and fired his flare gun wildly. The flare bounced off the wall, blinding us with red light and choking smoke. In the confusion, the creature lunged. It moved with terrifying speed. I heard Ben shout, then a sickening crunch of bone. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, slamming the heavy bulkhead door behind me, trapping Ben with the monster. I could hear his screams cut short. I made it back to the rec room, gasping for air, the sound of Ben's final screams echoing in my mind, replaying in a loop of horror. I told Briggs what happened. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight on my chest. But panic was worse. We were down 2 men. The creature was inside the secure perimeter. "How did it get in the vents?" Briggs asked, pale and sweating, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag. "They must be climbing the legs," I said, my voice trembling. "They're amphibious. They can climb. The vents lead to the outside. They found a way in." The realization was horrifying. The entire rig was accessible to them. We weren't safe anywhere. We needed a plan. We couldn't just hide and wait to be picked off one by one like rats in a barrel. "The flare stack," I said, an idea forming through the panic. "It's the highest point on the rig. If we can get up there and light it manually, it might be visible above the storm, a distress signal." It was a desperate long shot. The climb would be treacherous in the wind, and we'd be totally exposed. But it was better than waiting to die in a metal box. Briggs agreed. It was our only chance. We prepared our gear. We chose a team of 4, Briggs, myself, and 2 other roughnecks, Davis and Petro. We armed ourselves with fire axes and heavy tools, gripping them until our knuckles turned white. The plan was to move quickly to the access ladder for the flare tower. We stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tried to rip us off the deck, screaming in our ears. The rain was freezing, stinging our faces like buckshot.
We clipped our safety harnesses to the guide wires and began the slow, perilous climb. The metal rungs were slick with ice and oil, threatening to send us plummeting with every step. Below us, the ocean churned, a black abyss waiting to swallow anyone who fell. Every shadow looked like a monster. We moved in silence, communicating only with hand signals, eyes darting everywhere. The fear was a physical weight, heavier than our gear. I kept looking back, half expecting to see glowing blue eyes following us up the ladder. We made it to the first platform, 50 feet up. The wind was even worse here. We paused to catch our breath, huddled behind a machinery housing. That's when we heard it, above the wind, a metallic scratching sound on the grating below us. They were following us. The scratching got louder, faster, the sound of claws on steel echoing through the platform. Suddenly, a dark shape vaulted over the railing onto the platform. It wasn't the big one I'd seen in the corridor. It was smaller, sleeker, but just as terrifying. It was a pack hunter. Another one climbed up behind it, shaking water from its fur. We were trapped on the small metal grid. Briggs swung his axe, yelling a battle cry that was lost in the wind. The first creature dodged with unnatural agility and swiped at him, its claws sparking against his axe head. Davis stepped forward with a large pipe wrench, swinging wildly. He connected with the second creature's shoulder. It let out a high-pitched shriek and stumbled back, snapping its jaws at him. I used my welding torch, sparking it to life. The bright blue flame and the loud hissing sound seemed to startle them. They were creatures of the deep dark. Bright light and fire were alien to them. I thrust the torch toward the first one, scorching its fur, the smell of burnt hair mixing with the sea air. It recoiled, snarling, shielding its eyes. We had a momentary advantage. "Push them back," I yelled. We formed a tight line, using the weapons to keep them at bay, inching toward the next ladder. We were almost to the ladder when the bigger one, the alpha I'd seen in the corridor, appeared. It climbed onto the platform behind us, cutting off our escape. It was massive, its presence terrifying, blocking out the limited light. It ignored the torch flame, its eyes fixed on us with cold intelligence. It wasn't scared. It lunged at Partro, who was at the back of our group. Partro screamed, trying to defend himself with his axe, but the creature was too fast, too strong. It grabbed him and threw him with terrifying ease. He went over the railing without a sound, his body swallowed by the dark, disappearing into the black churning water below. The loss shocked us into silence. We hesitated for a split second, which was all the alpha needed. It turned its attention to Briggs. I stepped forward, thrusting the welding torch at its face to distract it. It swiped at me, knocking the torch from my hand. It skittered across the grating and fell over the edge. I was weaponless. Davis grabbed my arm. "Go! Climb!" he yelled, pushing me toward the ladder. He stood his ground with the wrench, facing the monsters to buy us time. I climbed. I didn't look back. I heard Davis shouting, the clang of metal on bone, then the sounds of a struggle, then absolute silence. I knew he was gone. Briggs was right behind me, his breath ragged, sobbing quietly. We were the only ones left of the climbing team. The flare tower rose another 100 feet above us, a skeletal metal structure swaying in the wind like a pendulum. The climb was brutal. My hands were numb, my muscles burning with lactic acid. The wind tried to tear me from the ladder with every step, rain blinding me. I focused only on the next rung, blocking out the fear, the cold, the memory of my crewmates dying below. Below us, I could see shapes moving on the platform we just left. They weren't following us up the tower yet. Maybe the structure was too thin, too precarious for their bulk. Or maybe they were just waiting, knowing we had nowhere else to go. We reached the top platform, a small metal cage around the massive flare tip. The view was terrifying, just churning black clouds and the raging ocean below. We were completely exposed to the elements. The manual ignition system for the flare was a heavy lever and a spark generator. It hadn't been used in years, covered in salt crust. Briggs grabbed the lever, pulling with all his might. It was stuck, frozen with rust and ice. "Help me!" he yelled over the wind, panic in his eyes. We both hauled on it, our feet slipping on the icy grating. With a loud screech of metal that sounded like a gunshot, it gave way.
Briggs fell back, gasping. I hammered the spark generator button. Nothing. The pilot light wouldn't catch in the wind. "Try again," Briggs shouted, pointing at the rising shapes below. I pressed it again and again, desperation mounting, my fingers raw. Finally, a small blue flame sputtered to life. It wavered, almost blowing out, then caught the main gas stream. With a deafening whoosh, a massive pillar of fire erupted into the night sky. The heat pushed back the cold instantly, searing our faces. The bright orange light illuminated the rig below, a beacon in the storm. It was the brightest thing for 100 miles. We had done it. Now, we just had to survive long enough for someone to see it.
The sudden light seemed to enrage the creatures below. We looked down and saw them swarming on the decks, shielding their eyes from the glare. Then, the Alpha started climbing the tower. It moved slowly but steadily, its massive claws hooking into the metal framework, ignoring the wind. It was coming for us. There was nowhere left to run. We were trapped at the highest point, with a 100-foot drop on all sides. Briggs looked at me, his face grim, lit by the flickering orange light. "We hold him off here," he said, "as long as we can." He still had his fire axe. I looked around and found a heavy metal pry bar left by a maintenance crew. It wasn't much, but it was something solid to hold. The Alpha reached the platform just below us. It paused, looking up, its blue eyes glowing fiercely in the firelight. It let out another one of those bone-vibrating roars, challenging us. It was a challenge. It was the apex predator claiming its territory. It began the final climb to our platform, shaking the entire tower. My heart pounded against my ribs. This was the end of the line. The Alpha hauled itself over the railing of our small cage. It filled the space, its massive bulk crowding us. The heat from the flare was intense, singing the creature's fur, but it didn't seem to care. It swiped at Briggs. He dodged and swung the axe, hitting it in the side. The blade bit deep, but the creature just snarled and backhanded him. Briggs flew against the railing, stunned, dropping the axe. It turned to me. I jabbed with the pry bar, aiming for its eyes. It caught the bar in one massive webbed hand and wrenched it from my grip like I was a child. I was defenseless. It towered over me, its breath foul with the smell of raw fish and decay. It raised a claw to strike, saliva dripping from its jaws. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night. The creature flinched, a bloody hole appearing in its shoulder. I looked down. Someone from the deck below had fired a flare gun, a survivor we didn't know about. The red flare was stuck in the creature's flesh, burning. It roared in pain and fury, distracted for a second, clawing at the burning projectile. That second was all I needed. I saw Briggs trying to get up. I saw the creature distracted by the burning flare. I didn't think. I just acted on instinct. I threw my entire body weight at the creature's legs, tackling it low with a desperate scream. It was like hitting a brick wall, but the surprise and the slippery grating worked in my favor. The creature stumbled, its balance lost on the slick metal. It clawed wildly, trying to grab something, but there was only air. It fell backwards over the low railing, its eyes locking with mine for one last second. It didn't scream. It just fell silently into the black void below, the red flare still burning in its shoulder, tracing a line of light, until it hit the water and vanished. I lay on the grating, gasping, unable to believe I was still alive. I crawled over to Briggs. He was conscious but groggy, bleeding from a cut on his head. "Is it gone?" he asked weakly. "Yeah," I said, my voice raspy. "It's gone." We were alone on the tower, the massive fire roaring above us. We huddled near the base of the flare flame for warmth, watching the decks below. The other creatures had retreated after their leader fell. They seemed to have melted back into the shadows and the sea, leaderless. The storm raged on, but the wind felt less hostile now, the fire a comforting presence against the dark. We didn't speak much. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion and grief. We had lost good men. We waited through the night, scanning the horizon for any sign of a ship or plane. Every hour felt like a lifetime. The cold seeped back into our bones, despite the fire. The fear hadn't left completely. It was just dormant, waiting for the light to fade again. I kept seeing the Alpha's eyes, the intelligence in them. Were there more like it down there? Was this just a scouting party? The ocean looked even darker, deeper, and more terrifying than before. It held secrets that were now awake and aware of us. We were just trespassers. Just before dawn, the storm began to break. The clouds lifted slightly, revealing a gray, bruised sky, and the wind dropped. Then we saw it, a tiny light on the horizon, growing steadily larger, a supply ship. They had seen our flare. A wave of relief washed over me so powerful my knees buckled. They radioed the reg. The surviving crew in the rec room answered, their voices cracking with emotion. We were saved. The ship couldn't dock in the rough seas, but they sent a helicopter at first light. Briggs and I were hoisted up first from the tower. As I hung in the harness, looking down one last time at the rig, it looked small and fragile against the vast ocean. The place that had been my workplace and my prison was now just a metal skeleton on the water. We landed on the ship's deck, greeted by stunned sailors who wrapped us in blankets. We were alive. But as I stood there, safe and solid, I couldn't shake the feeling of the deep gazing back at me. The company flew us back to shore. We were debriefed in a sterile conference room by men in suits who clearly didn't believe a word we said. We told them about the creatures, the attack, the glowing eyes. They nodded politely, taking notes, and called it mass hysteria induced by extreme stress and isolation. They explained away the missing men as tragic accidents during the storm, swept overboard by waves. They paid us handsomely to sign non-disclosure agreements. Standard procedure, they said, sliding checks across the polished mahogany table. They wanted to protect their stock price, not the truth. They were going to reopen the rig. They were sending a new crew out there. We tried to warn them, to tell them it was suicide, but they just smiled patronizingly. They didn't care. The oil must flow. I realized then that the real monsters weren't just in the ocean. Some wore suits and sat in boardrooms, willing to sacrifice lives for profit. Before I left the company offices, I managed to get a look at the geological survey data from the Vanguard's recent drilling. I slipped into an empty office and accessed the terminal. I had to know why they attacked us. Why now? The data showed that just before the attack started, the drill had breached a new, unusually dense rock layer deeper than they had ever gone before. Below that layer, the sensors had picked up a massive, anomalous energy signature. A large, hollow pocket. They hadn't just been drilling for oil. They had broken into something else. A chamber that had been sealed for millennia. An underwater ecosystem that had been cut off from the world. The creatures weren't random monsters of the deep. They were guardians. We had broken into their home, or perhaps their prison. The rig's activity had woken them up. The company knew about the anomaly. That's why they were so insistent on reopening the rig. They weren't just after oil anymore. They were after whatever was down there, whatever power source those creatures were protecting. I took the money and left the industry forever. I moved inland, as far from the ocean as I could get. I live in a small cabin in the mountains now, surrounded by trees instead of water. But I'm not free. I still dream about the rig every single night. I dream about the water closing over Ben, about patrol falling silently into the blackness. I dream about those glowing blue eyes staring at me from the dark. I can't sleep without a light on. Every time it rains, I flinch, waiting for the sound of claws on metal. I know what's out there now. I know that the ocean is a vast, dark kingdom that we have no right to invade. We are just trespassers, and the true owners are waking up. The company will keep drilling, keep poking the bear, until something worse than a pack of hunters comes up from the deep. I am safe on land, but I will never feel safe again. The ocean is vast, and it remembers.
I tried to go to the press, anonymously. I sent them my account, the details of the geological anomaly, and the coordinates of the rig. No one would touch the story. It was too fantastic, too unbelievable. And the oil company's lawyers were too powerful, burying the story before it could breathe. The new crew went out to the Vanguard a month later. I watched the news report, saw the smiling faces of the young roughnecks leaving the dock, ignorant of what awaited them. They were lambs to the slaughter, fed to the machine. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu. The cycle was restarting. The company wouldn't stop until a disaster happened that they couldn't cover up. I felt helpless. I had survived, but I hadn't saved anyone. The truth was buried under layers of corporate greed and seawater. The ocean kept its secrets well, and it was hungry for more. I turned off the TV, unable to watch them smile. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I stand outside my cabin and look up at the stars. They seem cold and distant, just like the lights on the rig. I think about the Alpha, falling into the abyss with that red flare burning in its shoulder. Did it die? Or is it healing deep down in the pressure and the cold, remembering my face, remembering the fire? I think about the chamber they breached, about what else might be sleeping down there, bigger and older than the Alpha. The world thinks it's safe, that we have conquered the planet. They are wrong. We live on a thin shell over a deep, dark world of nightmares, and sometimes the shell cracks. I know they are still out there, watching, waiting. And I know with a cold certainty that one day they will come back up. And next time, they won't stop at the rig. They will come for the shore.